Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today I'm kind of introing another chunk of my Goodreads Choice 2021 Sci-Fi Fantasy Nominees reading project, and this video is one that I'm pretty excited about. The two books that I'm planning to read for this episode are ones that are very different, first of all, but also they're ones that I was really struggling to categorize when I was kind of laying out how I wanted to break everything up to make this project manageable. And I realized the issue I was having is that they're both kind of hybrid genres. So the first book is A Master of Djinn by Peter Jelly Clark, and this one is a steampunk, alternate historical fantasy murder mystery. And then the other one is Sorrowland by River Solomon, and this one is, from what I can tell, kind of a blend of horror and fantasy. So I'm really excited to get to both of these. For A Master of Djinn, I've actually already read all of the short stories and novellas that precede it. And I really love the world that it's set in. This version of Cairo is just fascinating to me, and I really enjoy the blend of steampunk technology and magic. So I'm really excited to get into a full-length novel in this world. And then for Sorrowland, there was actually this literary festival that was happening in my city. It happens every year, and last year they had this panel discussion with K.M. Sparrow and River Solomon. And I was at the time reading Docile, which I'm actually currently still reading 7 months later, but that's not relevant. I was reading Docile at the time, and that was what made me go to watch this panel. And through watching that panel, I was just like fascinated and really enjoying everything that River Solomon was talking about in regards to Sorrowland during that. It was kind of a focus on like cults in fiction and identity and things like that. So it was a really interesting panel. But everything River Solomon said about this book just made me really want to pick it up. So I'm excited that I really have an excuse to go ahead and do that, because I have a lot of things that I would love to get to. And Sorrowland is not a book that I currently own, but I am getting it from the library, so it felt nice to have a little excuse to like bump it up my TBR a little bit. But I am thrilled to be getting to both of these now. I'm gonna start with A Master of Djinn because I currently have it on loan from the library, and that's gonna run out in a few days, so I wanna go ahead and read it so I can return it. And then I am just kind of waiting for my hold to come in on Sorrowland, so hopefully that will be soonish, but we'll see. I'm just gonna go ahead and dive into A Master of Djinn, and I will check back with you guys in a moment. So I meant to check in at like the 50% mark, but I got really absorbed and I completely forgot to do that. But I am now at like 75 to 80% done with A Master of Djinn, and I am loving it so far. This is a really interesting book because I've really enjoyed being back in the same world, in this like steampunk version of Cairo in the early 1900s. I think it's just such a fun setting. And I've also really enjoyed seeing all of the recurring characters, because Agent Fatma is the protagonist of one of the early short stories in this world. So she's now the protagonist of this book as well. And so there's some characters that recur from that short story. There's characters that recur as well from the novella, The Haunting of Tramcar 015. So it's been really fun seeing all these characters kind of coming together into one story. With that being said, I do think it is worth reading the short stories and novella before you get into this book, because there is a lot of reference to the events of those. And like I said, there's a lot of recurring characters, people who come in from these other stories and novella to build out the cast of this book. So I definitely think it's worth reading those first. But it's been a lot of fun being back in this world, and I do think the mystery here is really interesting. So in A Master of Djinn, this group of people is murdered, and the guy that they believe did it claims to be the scholar Al-Jahiz returned, who's basically this guy who let magic into the world 40 years ago and then disappeared. And so now he claims that he is that fellow returned, and that he is here to like basically save the people from the Egyptian government. So that's like the setup for the story. And Agent Fatma is having to like figure out who he is, how is he doing the things he's doing, and there's just a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that she's having to pull together from very different sources. There's also some really interesting stuff going on with like social commentary in the background with there's a lot of stuff about like colorism within Egypt. There is this kind of subplot with African Americans during this time leaving the US and moving to Cairo to escape Jim Crow, which I think is really interesting because some of Fatma's friends are like from New Orleans, and there's a really fun bit with them, and they're all musicians, and so she's like hanging out with them, and they're really fun. There's some other stuff about some of the commentary that came from the previous stories, particularly like women's suffrage in Cairo, which is a part of one of the earlier stories. So there's just a lot of interesting elements going on, and I'm really enjoying it. However, at this point, I think it's gonna be like a 4 to a 4.5 star for me. And the main thing that I've run into that has kind of dropped it a little bit for me is that, unlike where A Dead Djinn in Cairo had like not enough space to kind of build out its story, this one has plenty of space to build out its story, but the stakes feel lower. I haven't at any point felt, while reading any of the kind of tense action scenes, that any of the characters are really in significant danger. I don't think that there's this likelihood that any of them are going to die or have severe consequences for any of the stuff that they're going through, unless you count mental scars, which, like, sure, they're definitely gonna have some of those, but there's not like any real danger to their well-being in pretty much any of the action scenes. So that's like my only kind of gripe with this book, but I am loving it so far, and I've got about 100 pages left, so I'm gonna try and knock that out today, and I'll check back in with you when I have finished it. Okay, so I did finish A Master of Djinn just now, and I really enjoyed this book. I had a couple of issues with the ending, particularly with, there were some sections that felt a little like the characters were missing something really obvious, and as smart as the characters are and as resourceful as they are, that was kind of not believable to me, that they would miss something that was so clearly like right in front of their faces. So I know the book was trying to be, it was trying to like make a point about like, if you focused too much into one thing and you like want to believe this one thing, you'll find evidence to confirm it, basically about confirmation bias. Just with everything else that these characters had been through and everything they knew, it just didn't quite feel believable to me. It did get resolved later on, but I did have a little issue with that. And through to the end of the book, I still had some issues with it not feeling like the stakes were really high enough for the characters. Like, the stakes were high. It was definitely a lot of tense action, and particularly in the last like 50 pages, but it just never felt like any of the main characters were ever in any real danger. Just had this sense that, yeah, of course they're gonna make it through, because they always make it through, and there wasn't this feeling that there was any real danger for any of the characters. So those are my only two real gripes with the book, but other than that, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I think I said in my earlier update that it's worth reading the short stories that precede this novel beforehand. I still firmly believe that. I think that this book does a good job of kind of filling you in on what happens in the short stories, but you're going to get, I think, a lot more out of it if you've read those short stories beforehand. Overall, absolutely loved this. I think it's like gonna be a 4.5 star for me, and I'm glad that I finally picked it up, because I've been wanting to pick it up for a while. After I finished the short stories, I was really excited to get to this one. But yeah, that is the first book for this video down, and up next I'm going to be reading Sorrowland by River Solomon as soon as my library hold comes in, so fingers crossed that doesn't take too long, but we'll see. My hold for Sorrowland finally came in today. Came in like probably overnight or something. I checked it out this morning, and then happened to discover that they also had the audiobook available immediately. So I checked out both versions so that I can kind of alternate between the ebook and the audiobook. But I'm really enjoying this one so far. I've read about a third of it, and the writing, first of all, is fantastic. That's the first thing that struck me. Actually, going into Sorrowland, I'd been struggling with a couple of books I had tried picking up before. I'd just really not been able to focus on reading them, and I really just wasn't wanting to pick anything up. And I thought that maybe I was in the start of a reading slump. But no, it just turns out that I'm not vibing with the two books I tried to pick up before, because I have been devouring Sorrowland. I'm a third of the way through already. I read some of it during my lunch and then listened to some of it while I was working today, and just cannot put it down. It's so good. So Sorrowland is following Vern, who is this young woman who escapes a religious compound and flees into the woods, and she starts living in the woods, and there she gives birth to twins named Howling and Feral, and she raises them in the woods, and then has to, as they get older, kind of reckon with the compound that she left behind that is still trying to drag her back, as well as kind of facing the outside world head on, because she's never really been in the world outside of the compound. So she's having to deal with kind of two separate sides that are both in some ways antagonistic towards her, and at the same time she's undergoing several changes with her body that begin and are kind of subtle at first but become increasingly drastic and apparent. So there's some really interesting stuff happening, and I'm really enjoying the characters so far. I really like Howling and Feral. They're adorable, and they're also like really interesting and insightful characters. I also really like Vern's perspective on the world, because it's clear that she's been hurt so much by the world, but she wants so much to like keep pushing for her children, even if she has no kind of hope for herself. So I think that that's been really interesting. That being said, this is a very dark book. It tackles some very difficult topics, including suicidal ideation and self-harm, sexual assault, domestic violence. There's a lot of very dark stuff covered in the book, but I think that River Solomon is handling it in a really interesting way. So yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I'm hopefully gonna read some more this evening. I gotta do some editing as well. But yeah, I'm really glad that my hold finally came in, and I'm also really glad that it turns out I'm not in a slump. I just needed to pick up a better book. I thought we were gonna have some natural light in this clip, but forgot this window gets like no light. There's a wall on the other side. Anyway, I finished Sorrowland yesterday, and I absolutely adored this book. It is so good. It's a very dark book, and I think that it's difficult to read in some ways, and it's worth checking out the content warnings for the book, which definitely include things like off-page sexual assault, violence, domestic violence, pregnancy and birth, medical experimentation on people. There's a lot going on there, but I think that the book is so beautifully written. The writing is very lovely, and I think that River Solomon tackles the topics in the book in a really interesting way. Like it's done in a really compelling way, where it really encourages you to engage with the ideas that it's presenting you with, and to think about them more fully and think about them from angles that you maybe haven't thought about them before. And the book tackles, again, a lot of difficult topics. There's stuff, as I mentioned with content warnings, there's a large section of the book that centers on medical experimentation on Black people, which unfortunately has a long history in the US. It also talks a little bit about slavery and oppression, systemic racism, what else? Police brutality. So there's a lot of those topics in the book, and I just think that they're written in such a skillful way that it's really compelling to read, but it also pushes you to think more deeply about those topics. So I think it's very well done. And I also really like all of the characters. Vern is a really interesting main character. She's just very angry at the world in a lot of ways, and she's been through a lot, so you understand why her view of the world is the way it is. And it was really interesting to see her try to balance that kind of anger at the world and a disappointment in the world with the kind of tenderness and care that she put into caring for her two children. So I really enjoyed getting to see kind of all the different aspects of Vern's personality and her character, and the growth that she goes along in the course of the story. I also really like the side characters. Her children, Howling and Feral, are adorable, and I really like the way that they also like challenged Vern to think about the way that she was living her life. Not necessarily in like a I need to change way, but like in a what were her priorities, what mattered to her the most, how does she engage with other people. So I think that Howling and Feral were really interesting parts of her development, but they also got to be really interesting and distinct people themselves. I also really like some characters that show up later in the book. I guess I won't say their names so as not to spoil or anything, but there are these two characters that show up in the latter half of the book that I absolutely love, and I just really appreciated how they supported Vern and helped her basically deal with everything that she was dealing with, which was kind of a lot. But it's just all so well done, and I could not put the book down. It made me cry a couple of times, and I just think this book is so worth picking up. And I have to say, at this point, having read not all of the fantasy books, but having read a few of them, of the ones I've read so far, Sorrowland is the one I think most deserved to win of that group. It should have won the Best Fantasy Choice Award. But I also see why it didn't, because it is a little more on the horror side of things, so I think it's kind of reaching a more niche audience. And it is a very difficult book, and so I think maybe that's put some readers off of it, although it absolutely shouldn't. I think that it is very approachable in what it is trying to do. So I really like Sorrowland. It's a new favorite for me. I'm gonna have to go buy myself a copy. but I am so glad that I read it. And that's it for this video. I've read both of the books I intended to read. So let me know if you've read either of these books and what your thoughts were down in the comments. And if you like this video, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Saturday, so there is more content coming soon. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.